Why did no one notice the way she scanned the ground before stepping out of the truck? Not because she was quiet, not because she tried to disappear. It was something else, an economy of movement most people only earn after years of learning how not to get killed. Lieutenant Commander Reina Carter didn't stride into Camp Eagle Run like she was owed attention. She moved like someone who'd already seen the cost of it. The morning heat rose off the asphalt before the sun had fully claimed the sky. Dust didn't wait for wind. It just hung there, suspended, like it had resigned itself to this place long ago. Her boots met gravel with no hesitation, no announcement. She slid the door of the government pickup shut, not slammed, not gentle, just precise. There was no entourage, no footsteps shadowing hers. Just the faint, hollow clang of a flagpole tapping metal above the barracks, and the two instructors near the admin trailer, trying not to stare. One elbowed the other. That's the SEAL liaison, thought she was benched, back injury or something. She heard them. She didn't give them the courtesy of a turned head. Just kept walking, eyes forward, case file under one arm, sidearm holstered, sleeves rolled to her forearms with military crispness. She scanned the compound the same way she'd once scanned rooftops in villages where windows could blink at you wrong. Inside the main office, Captain Lowe stood by the whiteboard. He was the sort of man whose shirts never wrinkled and whose schedule didn't tolerate improvisation. He almost offered a handshake, then retracted it, settling for a nod. "Lieutenant Commander Carter, appreciate you making the trip out." Her answer was as neutral as a locked door. "Schedule said 700, I'm early." He tried to make it sound like a smile when he replied, "We run things sharp out here." "Good." He gestured to a map on the board scribbled in orange and blue marker, lines like veins threading through an imagined wound. "You're here to observe, not interfere. That clear?" "I'm not here to babysit. I verify protocol and instructor conduct. Notes go to interbranch command." His exhale was barely audible. "Fine by me." He tapped a roster pin beside the map. "Corporal Santos runs the yard, loud, but recruits follow him. Miller and Greer back him up. Watch Santos if you're watching anyone." "I watch everyone." He paused a beat as if weighing whether she meant it, then nodded once. They stepped back outside and the heat hit like a held breath. Across the sandlot, recruits moved in sluggish lines, adjusting vests, wiping sweat that had nowhere to go. An instructor's voice carried like a crack across metal, too much for the space, the kind of sound meant to fill silence rather than teach anything. Low pointed. "That's Santos." She didn't answer. Santos saw her, gave a crooked half-wave that tried to telegraph confidence and superiority in the same gesture. "That the SEAL desk jockey," he called out. "Thought she retired after a back tweak." She looked at him the way one might study a wall before choosing where to breach, angles, posture, break points. She offered nothing back. No nod, no smile. He held the stare too long before turning to his recruits. Lowe cleared his throat. "You'll be stationed out of Ops Trailer B. Evaluation starts at 1400. One more thing," he added, voice lowered. "Santos and his crew run this section like a kingdom. Don't expect them to roll over for paperwork." She met his gaze. "I'm not here for them to roll over. I'm here to see if they're teaching what they're supposed to." Lowe said nothing more. Some men didn't realize respect could exist in silence. By mid-afternoon, the sun pressed down like a hand that didn't lift. The sparring area squatted under a shade cloth stretched unevenly across rusted poles, flapping at the corners. Blue mats swallowed heat like coals dressed in vinyl. Recruits lined the edges, sweat soaking their shirts, some shifting anxiously, some hardened enough to pretend they were. Reina stood at the fringe, arms tucked behind her back. No voice, no posture telegraphing authority, just stillness. Stillness that didn't invite challenge. It dared it. Corporal Santos prowled in front of the line like a man auditioning for a rank he already believed he owned. No flinching, no retreat. If your lungs work, your body better follow. The calls echoed, half-hearted in places. Recruits mirrored noise without technique, arms flaring, feet sliding, adrenaline trying to imitate training. She watched their heels, their breathing, the ones who fought ghosts instead of opponents. On the third pairing, she stepped forward and said a single word. "Stop." It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. The two recruits froze mid-grapple. Riina knelt without hurry. "You're locking your shoulder before you breathe. That'll get you dropped. Reset. Breathe first. Move second." One recruit nodded. The other glanced at Santos as if asking permission. Santos didn't give it. He barked toward the rest. "Everybody stay in position. Don't reset unless I tell you to reset." The kid froze, stuck between two currents. Riina stood, voice even. "Corporal," I gave him a correction. "He needs to reset his stance before continuing." "And I'm telling him to hold," Santos shot back, stepping closer. "This is my yard, Commander, my recruits, my cadence." The shift was microscopic, but everyone felt it. The unspoken gravity of hierarchy meeting ego head-on. Some of the instructors straightened. Some recruits watched from the corners of their eyes. "Your yard, my evaluation," she said. "If you're teaching improper form, I document it. That's why I'm here." His jaw tightened. She could see the impulse, the one that makes certain men try to win with volume when skill won't bend. Instead, he gave a tight smile and waved a hand. "Fine, reset, happy." She didn't respond, didn't need to. She stepped back and resumed writing. The tension didn't crackle, it settled, quiet and dense. Miller, leaning near the rear, muttered to Greer, "Bet she logs how many times we blink." Greer snorted. "Paper seals write good reports, that's about it." Riina wrote names, times, specific breaches. Not because of ego, because paper didn't argue and silence recorded everything. By evening, the light had gone rust-colored across the yard. The mess tent glowed under flickering fluorescence, voices spilling over tables. Recruits compared bruises like currency. Instructors replayed drills they'd only half-executed but fully believed they had. She sat alone at the back, meal untouched, case file open. She reviewed the day without tuning into anyone else's noise. The tent flap slapped open. Santos, Miller, and Greer strode in wearing arrogance like sweat. They made sure to carry it loud. Santos saw her first. "Command royalty graces the chow line." Miller grabbed a tray. "Wonder if she eats regulation portions too." Greer piled mashed potatoes. "Heard seals get steak at Pendleton. Guess she's slumming it tonight." She didn't look up. "You boys done?" Santos slid onto the bench across from her without invitation. "Just curious, ma'am. Never met a liaison who filled chows with the rank and file. Thought your kind preferred air-conditioned paperwork." Miller sat next to him. "What's it like being the one SEAL who writes evaluations instead of making them?" She closed the folder, "Keeps the noise down." Greer leaned forward. "That true you got pulled from ops for a back injury, or was it attitude?" She looked up just long enough. "Both heal slower than ego." That landed harder than any shout could. A few recruits overheard. None pretended they didn't. Santos recovered with a smirk. "Don't get touchy, Commander, just breaking the ice. Team building." She rose, sliding the folder under her arm. "You're in uniform, act like it." The words were soft, but they cut the air clean. Even nearby conversations dipped. Miller lifted a fork in a mock salute. "Yes, ma'am." She stepped past him. As she did, he rose just enough to shoulder-check her. Clean, deliberate, a hollow thud against her ribs. She didn't flinch, didn't even shift her stance. She turned her head slightly. "Enjoy your meal, Corporal." Then she was gone, into the night air that smelled of sand and diesel. Behind her, the laughter resumed, but something in it had thinned. In the hallway leading to her bunk, the silence met her like an equal. Single room, metal desk, flickering lamp. She didn't log the shoulder check. She logged training infractions. Phase 3 protocol. Breath control drills instructors should have been prepared to demonstrate long before teaching them. She found the clause buried in the manual. Instructors failing evaluation would face suspension from duties pending remediation. It had been signed, filed, approved. They'd counted on no one enforcing it. She closed the file and stared at the ceiling. The quiet wasn't a retreat, it was a countdown. By the time the armory lights cast long shadows against the walls later that night, she'd already chosen not to escalate. She would do something quieter, something that would ring louder than any report. What they mistook for paperwork was simply patience waiting for its moment to step forward. And no one at Camp Eagle Run, not even Santos, had realized yet that patience was her sharpest weapon. How many steps did it take for a warning to turn into a memory you never outran? The steel door at the armory end of the corridor shut behind her with a hollow clap that echoed longer than it should have. Inventory checks were quiet work, the kind no one volunteered for, and no one bothered to interrupt. She moved through the fluorescent hum like she'd been built for low light and silence, clipboard tucked under one arm, her focus narrowed to serial numbers and signatures. She should have heard them sooner. 3 shadows peeled from the wall just beyond the corner. Santos in front, his grin already waiting like the punchline to a joke he hadn't earned. Miller and Greer flanked behind him, close enough to catch his confidence if it slipped. "Evening, Commander," Santos said. "Didn't peg you for late shift file work." She kept walking. "Checking storage, you should be in quarters." "Couldn't sleep," Miller said. "Too much excitement after dinner." "Then run laps." Santos stepped into her path, close enough she could smell coffee gone cold on his breath. "You keep talking like you outrank someone." "Step aside, Corporal." He didn't. His eyes had that glint, the kind born from years of being the loudest in rooms that never held him accountable. "We're all about teamwork here. Thought maybe you could show us one of those SEAL breathing tricks." Greer tried to laugh. "Yeah, like when you're pinned and can't move. How's that work again?" Miller's chuckle filled the tight space like a match dropped into dry brush. She stood still, weight balanced. "Walk away, all of you." Santos leaned in. "You think you walk in, write reports, make us look bad. Out here, respect isn't ink and signatures. It's earned. Then earn it somewhere else." For a second, no one breathed. Then Miller muttered, "Come on, man, she's not worth." But Santos was already moving. The first shove came like a test, open-palmed, hard enough to send her shoulder back a step. Her boot slid half an inch across the floor. She didn't raise her hands, didn't blink. "That was your warning," she said quietly. He sneered, "Here's mine." The kick came from the hip, fast, clean, boot heel straight into her abdomen. It didn't make a dramatic sound. No crack of bone, no shouted curse. Just a dull, wet thud followed by the air being punched from her lungs in one sharp exhale. Pain didn't announce itself, it bloomed. She folded halfway, one knee hitting the floor, both hands bracing against concrete to keep the world from spilling sideways. The clipboard clattered once against the wall, then stilled. Her diaphragm seized. Breath locked behind her ribs like someone had welded the air out of reach. Sound thinned to a distant ringing. The edges of the corridor faded, light shrinking to a narrow tunnel. "Don't fight it." Training spoke before her thoughts lined up. "Let the body reset." 1, 2, 3. Thin air slid back in, shaky and insufficient, but there. The pain radiated outwards, sharp fatting into a deep spreading ache. Her palms found the cold floor, concrete, real, solid. 4, 5. Her vision steadied. Santos was breathing harder than she was. Miller shifted uneasily. Greer muttered something she couldn't hear. No one reached for her. No one helped. No one dared get closer. She rose slow, not from pride but precision. One hand pressed to her abdomen, the other hanging free. Breath shallow, controlled. She met Santos's eyes without blinking. No rage, no tremor, just focus, the kind that made men like him remember they weren't built half as strong as they pretended to be. He looked away first. "Come on," he said to the others. She got the message. Boots echoed down the corridor, their retreat swallowed by the hum of lights overhead. The laughter that trailed behind them was thin, poorly constructed, the kind born from fear disguised as bravado. When the sound faded, only silence stayed. Riina stayed on her feet another 10 seconds before straightening the page on the clipboard. Her hand trembled once, then stopped. She smoothed the single crumple, lifted the file, and walked out of the corridor without looking back. Her silhouette cut clean through the floodlight at the end of the hall, upright and small and unbroken. Dust swirled behind her, catching the glow like ash dancing in a furnace draft. The bruise made itself known the next morning in the mirror of the locker room, faint purple spreading beneath skin, just left of center. The kind of injury that screamed louder if you gave it attention. She didn't. She unbuttoned just enough to assess, pressed gently once. No fracture, no swelling beyond pattern. The memory that surfaced came uninvited but useful. Coronado, underwater qualification, 3rd hour, mask stripped, hands bound, saltwater burning the lungs, instructors holding them under until panic wasn't something to resist but something to command. A man's voice through waves, control the panic, Carter. The moment you lose your breath, you'll spend your life chasing it. She'd nearly blacked out at minute 3, but she'd passed, not because she fought the hold, but because she waited for the exact second the world stopped spinning before she rose. She wrapped her abdomen in black compression fabric, not to hide the bruise, to breathe through it. Each layer pulled tight, not too tight, precision over pain. Lights flickered to full brightness as the sensors caught movement. She didn't flinch at the mirror. She met her own reflection with the same stillness she offered everyone else, then fastened her uniform, clipped her badge, and walked out. By 600, she was alone in the yard. The sun hadn't fully breached the horizon, but light leaked across the sand like a secret someone tried to contain. She checked the mats for tears, adjusted the camera angles on the wall-mounted surveillance units, and laid out gauze beside the first aid crate. Every motion recorded in a corner of her mind, reserved for things that could be used later. 3 cones formed a triangle at center mat. Engagement zone, regulation, logged. By the time the first recruits arrived, yawning, carrying coffee like hope, she had already completed the roster. Santos, Miller, and Greer, all on the rotation. Captain Lowe wouldn't arrive until later. That suited her. She stood at the center mat, clipboard in one hand, evaluation binder in the other. The bruise pulsed under the wrap with every inhale, but pain didn't dictate posture. Stillness did. The first trainee who stepped into the ring found her already watching. "Let's begin," she said. By 7:30, the yard had found a different kind of quiet. Not the hush of sleep or the lull of routine. It was the hush of recalibration, where noise pulled back to make room for something unfamiliar. 2 lines of recruits stood at formation, instructors behind them, eyes flicking toward the whiteboard where fresh letters marked the day's assessment. Phase 3, Breath Control Combat Evaluation. Some of them had never heard the phrase spoken aloud. Most assumed it was a relic from a manual too outdated to enforce. She stood in front of them, voice even. Today's exercise is not about strength, not about speed, it's about control. Murmurs rippled through the lines like wind across tarp. You'll be paired off. Each of you will engage in 1-minute restricted breath contact. On command, you exhale, then begin. No talking, no preemptive movement. You engage only on contact. If you speak, breathe loud, or break form, the drill resets. Someone whispered, "What?" Santos laughed under his breath. "She wants us to spar while holding our breath." She didn't look at him. The goal is to stay composed under deprivation, technique over oxygen, Because in the field, you won't always get to breathe before it begins. Then she checked the roster. Instructor pairings go first, Corporal Santos front and center. A ripple passed through the recruits, heads turned. Some held breath without realizing. Santos stepped forward, carrying his smirk like a shield. "Ladies first," he muttered. She stepped onto the mat opposite him. "Clock starts on contact." They exhaled. The first touch was barely a gesture, her fingers brushing his sleeve before withdrawing. His shoulders tensed. He waited. She moved again, contact on his elbow. He grabbed. That was the mistake. She dipped low, pivoted with a shift of weight so controlled it looked practiced in silence. Swept his stance with one motion. He hit the mat flat on his back, air slamming out of him in a surprised grunt. She reset before he'd fully registered being grounded. "Round 2, she said. He got up slower this time. The second contact, he hesitated. She was already there before he made sense of it, grabbing his wrist, rotating his elbow, using his own breathlessness to steer him off balance. He stumbled, caught nothing but air. Her grip left no marks but all the meaning. Miller stepped up next, muttering, "This is a joke." She didn't answer. Same rules, one breath on contact. She tapped his collarbone. He swung on instinct. She stepped under the arc of motion with almost surgical timing, redirected his momentum with a forearm to the sternum, and planted him on his heels. He tried again, grabbing for her wrist. She rolled through it, slid behind him, elbow touching the space between rib and spine, a simulated break that would have ended the fight if she'd meant it. She stepped back, reset. The whispers had stopped. Even the air seemed to hold itself still. Recruits didn't watch with awe. They watched with recognition, the delayed understanding that everything they'd witnessed from her so far had been choice, not limit. Greer entered with hesitation. She brushed his wrist once. He didn't move, tested the opposite hip. Nothing. She waited, breath silent, then stepped inside his stance and placed one finger gently against his lower back. His balance crumpled. He caught himself barely. She nodded once, better. When all three stood off the mat again, sweat on their collars and silence on their tongues, Santos wiped his face with the back of his hand. "You planned this." She met his stare. "No, you did." Captain Lowe had arrived at some point. No one had seen him walk in. He said nothing during the drill, just folded his arms and observed. When he saw the bruise flash across the screen during playback later, just a glimpse when she'd adjusted gear, he didn't ask how it got there. He didn't need to. How long could someone pretend not to see the truth when it was already caught on camera? The operations trailer smelled like old coffee and dust trapped in air vents built for cooler climates. Captain Lowe stood at the center table with the remote in one hand, eyes fixed on the mounted screen. The footage played in silence, only the mechanical hum of the AC unit breaking the stillness. Three instructors, Santos, Miller, Greer, sat off to the side in folding chairs that suddenly looked too small for the weight they carried. Santos leaned back with his arms crossed tight, jaw grinding behind the pretense of indifference. Miller fidgeted with his knee bouncing under the table. Greer's eyes kept darting from the screen to the floor, to the door, then back again like he was waiting for someone to announce this wasn't real. Lowe didn't look at them. He watched the playback like he was tracking a training failure on loop. Riina moved through the drill with the same unshaken economy she'd shown on the mat. Every takedown clean, every pivot precise. When she swept Santos to flat-back contact, Lowe hit pause mid-fall. "Look at that stance," he said, not facing anyone. No one responded. He hit play. The screen showed her adjusting her undershirt seam after the second pairing. The fabric lifted just briefly, and there it was, faint but undeniable, a bruise blooming low along her abdomen, purple edged with shadow. No makeup, no exaggeration. The pause button clicked again. Silence expanded, thick and sharp-edged. Lowe finally turned. "You're going to tell me," he said quietly, "that this was a coincidence." No answer, not even a lie. He looked at Rihanna. She stood near the door, hands behind her back, posture even, not defiant, not meek, present. "You want to file a complaint?" he asked. "No." The word didn't come out cold. It came out steady, same tone and weight as every other thing she'd said since she arrived. "I already ran the drill." Lowe studied her a moment. "You're saying that takedown session was what, your version of paperwork?" "I followed regulation," she said. "All instructors are subject to evaluation under Phase 3 protocols. Your signatures are on the sign-off sheet." He didn't refute it because he couldn't. "They made contact first," she added. "Unreported, unprovoked. I chose not to escalate, I chose to teach." Lowe exhaled once through his nose. Something in his stance shifted. It wasn't apology. It wasn't admiration. It was understanding, the quiet kind older men reserved for moments that forced them to see who'd actually been holding the line. He turned back to the instructors. "Corporal Santos, Petty Officers Miller and Greer, you're suspended from all instructional duties effective immediately. I'll forward the footage to command with a summary of what happened and what didn't." Miller opened his mouth. "Sir." Lowe didn't raise his voice, not a word. Greer stared at the floor as if it might open up and swallow him. Santos's jaw tightened, but whatever comeback he'd prepared died before reaching air. None of them protested the bruise on the screen. Bruises built stories by themselves. Lowe looked back at Rihanna. For the first time his voice carried something unguarded, not warmth, not approval, but respect newly calibrated. "You could have dragged this through every channel," he said. "Instead, you made it a lesson they won't forget." She said nothing. Lowe gave a faint nod. "Get some rest, you've earned it." She didn't acknowledge that either. She didn't need rest. She needed silence, and she'd already earned that 10 times over. Outside, late light bled into sand and metal until everything wore the same gold skin. The yard stood half-shadowed, half-glowing. The mat from the morning still lay unrolled, untouched. No one had dared move it. No one wanted to claim ownership over the spot they'd watched reshape 3 men in real time. Recruits clustered in loose circles across the lot, catching breaths, pretending to check messages. Conversations drifted in low tones, not gossip, calibration. She didn't even raise her voice, someone said near the benches. Another answered. Did you see how she moved? Like she'd already done the fight in her head an hour before it started. Private Rosas, still fresh enough to remember fear at full volume, stared at the mat like it held answers. You think she knew they'd come at her? Chen, older by only months but aged by deployments no one asked about, nodded. She didn't need to know, she just didn't flinch. Near the motor pool, Petty Officer Hayes sat cross-legged on a crate with 3 other instructors who'd steered clear of Santos's orbit. Corporal Vega shook her head. "I've been here 6 months," she said. "Watched Santos run that yard like it was his personal kingdom. Nobody checked him. Nobody could." Hayes took a long drink from a canteen. She didn't check him with words. Vega's voice leveled. "No." "She checked him with the same rules he's supposed to be teaching," Hayes said. "That's what makes it hurt." One of the younger instructors, a kid with 2 years and the expression of someone who hadn't yet survived consequence, asked, "You think Command'll actually do anything?" Hayes glanced at the operations trailer door where Lowe was still inside. He saw the footage. Carter didn't give him a choice. She documented everything, ran it by the book, and made them look exactly like what they are. "Which is what?" "Loud," Hayes said simply. "Loud and sloppy, and in this job that gets people killed." The words didn't echo, they just landed and stayed. Across the yard, silence replaced the usual bragging. No one compared bruises. No one reenacted takedowns that weren't theirs. The air felt different, like someone had turned down the background noise of ego. It wasn't awe, it wasn't fear. It was understanding. Riina walked past them with fresh roll of gauze tucked under her arm, expression unreadable, steps even. She didn't slow for glances or side talk. She didn't need to. Those who'd once mistaken her quiet for passivity now recalculated what quiet actually meant. Near the equipment shed, a young Marine hesitated before stepping into her path. He couldn't have been more than 20, shoulders squared like someone had taught him pride before teaching him restraint. "Ma'am." She paused, turned her head slightly. "Can I ask you something?" "Ask." His eyes flicked down, just briefly, toward the wrap now hidden under uniform fabric, then back up steadier. "How'd you stay calm after he stopped himself, not sure if nomming the act broke some unspoken rule. After what happened?" Riina studied him for a moment, not to measure him, just to decide if an answer mattered. "Because losing your temper hurts longer than losing your air." He didn't nod. He didn't need to. Understanding carved itself where agreement couldn't reach. She walked on. Inside the shed, she set the gauze on the counter, peeled off her jacket, and unwrapped the compression tape. The bruise had darkened, purple shading into black at the edges, the center a deep red pressure ring. She pressed gently with 2 fingers, testing for sharpness. Pain answered, but not enough to stop her. She cleaned the skin, rewrapped fresh gauze, slow, methodical, not hiding it, managing it. Outside, boots banged against metal grates. A door slammed somewhere across the yard. The flag at the pole finally lowered for the evening, metal clips tapping hollow against steel. She didn't need thanks, didn't need apology. Those things were loud and temporary. The way the recruits looked at her now said more than either. Not with worship. Not with fear. With understanding that silence was not the absence of power. It was proof of control. And in her world, control was the last breath before victory. Somewhere in the quiet, a question hung without being spoken. What would they have done if she'd hit back? The better question was simpler. Why did they think she needed to? What changes in a place first, the rules, or the way people start looking at them? By the time the night dropped over Camp Eagle Run, the desert wind had thinned to a whisper. Most of the compound was dark except for the armory strip and the pole lights near the motor pool, each one throwing long slabs of pale illumination across concrete. Riina stepped out of the equipment shed, jacket back on, uniform squared, breath steady under the fresh wrap. The bruise still throbbed, but the rhythm of it had become background noise. She didn't head to quarters. Not yet. The compound at night was different, quieter, stripped of posture. Voices traveled farther, but footsteps did not. People spoke low when they thought no one was listening. She moved past the satellite trailers toward the perimeter wall, taking the long way as if she were simply clearing her head. She passed 2 recruits on smoke break behind the mess hall. They stopped talking when they saw her, not out of fear, out of something closer to recalibration. One nodded. She gave a short nod back and kept walking. The sky had shifted to a deep, bruised violet by the time she reached the yard again. The training mats still lay rolled where she'd left them. Someone was supposed to have stored them an hour ago. No one had. She walked the perimeter of the lot in silence, boots stirring small pockets of dust that lifted and fell like thoughts too heavy to stay airborne. Earlier that evening, after leaving the trailer, Captain Lowe had stayed inside longer than any of the men who'd been seated there. The footage still paused on the screen, the bruise still visible. No one had turned it off. He didn't question her injury because there was no excuse he could create that outranked what video evidence already decided. And he didn't argue the suspensions because authority comes with teeth, but integrity requires bite. Somewhere between the office and the moment she stepped outside, the weight of what she'd done had begun to ripple, not loud, not fast, but deeply. Across the camp, the barracks hummed with muffled conversations, not the kind laced with mockery, The kind spoken when people think change might arrive wearing a face they didn't expect. Inside one of the dorm wings, 3 recruits sat on the floor between bunks, backs against metal lockers. Rosas, Chen, and a corporal named Deaver who'd kept to himself most of the cycle. They didn't talk about Santos. Not directly. They talked about breath. "You ever hold your air like that?" Rosas asked, mimicking the way Riina had stayed silent while moving through the drill. Chen shook his head. "Not like that, that wasn't breathing, that was something else." Deaver exhaled slowly. "That was control, that's the difference. She wasn't fighting them, she was already ahead of them." In the next wing over, 2 female recruits, Ferris and Nalin, lay on their bunks, boots off, socks dirty, still wide awake. The lights were low but not out. Nalin stared at the top slats of the bunk above her. "You think she got hit before yesterday?" Ferris didn't answer right away. She didn't look surprised. "That's what I mean." Their voices stayed quiet, but the thought was, strength unannounced is strength that travels. Not far from them, in the instructor's quarters, Hayes sat at a metal desk writing something longhand on yellow legal paper. He didn't drink coffee, didn't look at his phone. The clock on the wall ticked each second like a measured heartbeat. Vega came by his doorway, leaning on the frame. "They're not talking much tonight." "Good. You think command will back low on the suspensions?" Hayes stopped writing. "There's footage, and it's attached to paperwork stamped with his signature." Vega crossed her arms. "Santos will try to spin it, all 3 of them will." Hayes looked up at her. "They can spin it any way they want, doesn't change who hit first." She didn't press further. She spent long enough in places where truth was always late to the fight, but this one had arrived early and with witnesses. Down at the far edge of the compound, near the vehicle bays, headlights swept across the lot as a transport truck eased in late. Supplies from Pendleton. Crates, ice chests, sealed cargo. The driver hopped out and started unloading without ceremony. He'd heard a rumor about a SEAL liaison on-site, but rumors often showed up wearing the wrong face. Riina crossed back toward her quarters only when the stars had fully claimed the sky. The corridors were silent except for the occasional bark of a generator kicking against fatigue. Her room was as she'd left it: small desk, metal-framed cot, lamp that flickered like a bad memory. She didn't turn on the overhead light. She set the clipboard on the desk, unholstered her sidearm with habitual precision, and rested it atop the case file. She unbuttoned the upper layer of her uniform and sat on the edge of the cot, elbows on her knees, head bowed just slightly, not from pain, from calculation. She didn't wonder if Santos would retaliate. He already had, and men like him rarely came back for a second round smarter than the first. She didn't think about how others saw her. She thought about protocol, the details in the manual that officers half remembered and NCOs pretended didn't exist. She had enforced something older than paperwork, justice through demonstration, the kind that stayed in the body longer than bruises. She lay back slowly, careful not to pull against her ribs. The cot springs gave under her weight with a low groan. For the first time in weeks, she closed her eyes without staying half awake. Morning arrived not with reveille, but with the scrape of boots in the gravel outside and the dull clang of flagpole clips slapping metal in uneven rhythm. The compound stirred like a giant exhale. She was up before the second clip hit. The bruise felt different now, less sharp, more anchored. She dressed without looking at it. The wrap stayed in place. Her movements were slower but no less precise. By 5:30, she was outside the ops trailer reviewing documentation. Each infraction she had recorded the previous day was sorted and time-stamped in her notes. She wasn't compiling a case. She was closing a loop. Across the yard, recruits jogged laps in loose formation. Their cadence was quieter than usual, not weak, focused. Even the ones who used to perform for volume found their steps lining up with something steadier. An hour later, Captain Lowe emerged from the admin building with a folder under his arm and a face that had not slept long. He scanned the yard, eyes landing briefly on Riina. He didn't call her over. He didn't need to. She joined him at the whiteboard outside the briefing trailer, where the words Phase 4 prep were still half erased from the previous cycle. "We'll need written accounts from anyone who witnessed the contact," he said. "I already logged the names." He blinked once, not surprised, not annoyed, just adjusting to a new reality where things got done before he asked. "I sent word to command," he continued. "They want preliminary summaries by end of week." "They'll have them." He hesitated before asking, "Do you want reassignment after this?" "No." He nodded. He didn't ask why. He might have once, not today. Across the yard, Santos stood with Miller and Greer near the far edge of the barracks, all three no longer in instructor rotation. Their nameplates had been pulled from the board. Their replacement badges hadn't been issued yet. They stood in a line that looked less like solidarity and more like a wall waiting to crumble. Riina didn't look their direction. She didn't need to. Men who rely on noise rarely survive silence. By midday, word had reached other instructors from other outposts through quiet texts and half-coded emails. Nobody said Santos's name. They didn't have to. They mentioned only this: someone made Phase 3 real. In the mess tent, Ferris and Nolan sat again across from Rosas and Chen. They ate without hurrying. The room felt level. No one held court. No one performed dominance with volume. It wasn't peace. It was balance. On the far side of the tent, Hayes and Vega ate in silence. After a while, Vega spoke without looking up. "You think she's staying?" Hayes didn't answer immediately. He took another bite, swallowed, and only then said, "She'll stay until the lesson finishes teaching. And after that, she won't need to say a word." Outside, the wind kicked up dust in soft spirals across the lot. The flag rattled once, then stilled. The quiet wasn't tense anymore. It was directional, moving outward like ripples someone forgot to stop. Riina walked the perimeter again that afternoon, clipboard in hand. She didn't check for eyes on her this time. She wasn't hiding and she wasn't showcasing. She was present, which in places like Camp Eagle Run was rarer than strength. As she passed the mats still rolled near the edge of the ring, she paused just long enough to lift one corner and set it back down. Nothing more. But the smallest things, in places built on hierarchy, can feel like earthquakes. By dusk, lights flicked on one by one around the compound, casting long shadows across the sand. Quiet meals, routine checks, briefings without argument, none of it accidental. The compound wasn't changed, not yet, but it had been interrupted. And interruptions, when measured and deliberate, don't end with noise. They end with memory. Who decides when something is truly over? The one who started it, or the one who finished it without speaking? The sun was still low when the next shift of recruits assembled for weapons inspection. The armory doors groaned open, metal against metal, and Petty Officer Hayes stood clipboard in hand, calling names with the slow authority of someone who had seen chaos and didn't fear its return. Recruits moved in practiced lines, some still glancing toward the spot where Santos used to stand with arms folded and opinions louder than orders. Santos, Miller, and Greer had been reassigned, temporarily, the notice said, to administrative review, which meant their access to recruits had been suspended, their hours reduced to quiet spaces and clipped answers. They moved through the yard with the slouch of men forced to carry their own reputation instead of letting it walk ahead of them. Riina didn't cross their path. She had no reason to. She spent the morning reviewing footage logs, updating her notes, and confirming compliance documentation with a precision that made subordinates nervous and superiors alert. At 900, she walked the eastern boundary of the compound where the sand met the concrete barriers. The bruise under her wrap still ached with each step, but it was no longer pain to chase. It was pain she owned, not pain owed to someone else. She passed two Marines sweeping gravel from the motor pool entrance. They nodded at her, quiet recognition rather than ceremony. One of them, kid with a scar on his cheek and hands still pink from first-year calluses, straightened as she went by. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Inside the admin trailer, Lowe sat at his desk with an open folder and a phone pressed to one ear. His tone stayed measured, even when the voice on the other end challenged him. Phase 3 protocols were signed off, he said. We enforced them. The footage supports every action taken. He paused, listening. No, she didn't file a complaint. No, I didn't request one. The suspension stands. Rihanna waited near the doorway until he finished. He hung up and rubbed the bridge of his nose. They want a formal statement about the incident, he said. You'll have one. He glanced up. You're not obligated to include personal detail. I don't intend to. He watched her for a beat longer than necessary. You're aware Santos is going to push back. He'll claim you provoked it. She didn't blink. Footage says otherwise. He'll try to talk his way around it. She turned to leave. Then he should have learned to listen before he tried to talk. Lowe didn't call her back. There were moments when leaders understood they weren't the ones leading anymore. They were just clearing the path for whoever already had. Outside, instructors not under suspension gathered near the obstacle course. Petty Officer Hayes, Corporal Vega, and a sergeant named Ellison reviewed the revised rotation chart. None of them said Santos's name. They didn't have to. His absence had a sound, like static finally removed from a channel you'd forgotten was noisy. Hayes folded the chart and handed it to Vega. She won't stay after the evaluation, he said quietly. Vega shook her head. You think she'll ask for reassignment? No, he said. She'll leave when the rest of us stop pretending we need her here to do what we were already trained to do. Ellison looked between them. You think anyone going to step out of line after this? Hayes didn't smirk. Only the ones who think they're louder than their own breath. The day moved under the weight of unspoken adjustments. Recruits stood straighter in line. Instructors gave corrections without posturing. Even the mess hall felt different, less performance, more presence. Rihanna took no meals with the others that day. She preferred the time to review documentation, to ensure not a single infraction could be erased by memory. Paper remembered better than ego. That evening she returned to the mat, not for a demonstration, not for a drill, alone. The sky stretched pale orange to violet and the yard lay mostly empty. A few recruits jogged laps at the far end. Others scrubbed down gear in the shade of the motor pool's awning. She stepped onto the mat and stood still at the center, letting the memory of yesterday's impact settle into the dirt beneath her boots. No one approached. No one interrupted. Silence wasn't fragile here. It was finally being used correctly. Behind her, footsteps slowed. She didn't turn, it was Hayes. He stopped at the edge of the mat. Command sending someone to review your notes tomorrow. She nodded once. You want me there? No. He watched her profile against the setting light for a moment. They're not going to say it. They don't need to. They won't thank you. They shouldn't. He shifted his hands to his pockets. Some of the recruits were asking if you'd run another control drill. They don't need another one. He gave a short exhale, not laughter, just acknowledgement. Lowe said the same. She finally glanced his way. They'll remember the lesson longer than the bruise. And Santos. She looked past him toward the barracks. Santos will remember the silence. Hayes didn't follow her when she left. He stood there a long while, staring at footprints in the mat that didn't belong to him. Night came slower than the one before. Conversations in the barracks died early. Some recruits polished boots without being told. Others rewound in their heads the moment a boot met her ribs and she rose without rage. In the instructor quarters, Miller sat on the edge of his bunk, elbows on his knees, staring at the wall. His voice barely broke the space between him and Greer across the room. She didn't even hit back. Greer didn't look up. That's what made it worse. Miller's jaw flexed. Never saw someone take a shot like that and wait. She looked at him like she was holding his breath for him. Greer finally raised his head. You think she's done? Miller shook his slowly. People like her don't need to do things twice. Down the hall, Santos lay awake on his back, staring at the stained ceiling tile above his rack. The silence felt heavier than the kick he'd thrown. No one had spoken to him directly since morning, not even the ones who usually followed his lead. He tried to rehearse what he'd say when command asked for his version. Each draft sounded smaller. He replayed the moment she stood after the hit, the way she looked at him without blinking. There was no accusation in her eyes, no threat, just something colder and infinitely more dangerous, clarity. He'd wanted fear, he got reflection. The smell of diesel drifted in through the window gap. A truck was idling near the compound perimeter. He turned to face the wall and pretended sleep, but his pulse wouldn't obey. On the opposite side of camp, under the dim lamp in her quarters, Riina sat at the desk writing her final entry of the day. Not about what they did, about what they didn't. She described uncorrected forms, unauthorized contact, deficient breath control practice. Each note dated, timed, logged. She didn't mention the kick. Not because it didn't matter, but because the consequences of it already existed in the footage, in the suspensions, in the way no one raised their voice in the chow tent anymore. She ended the entry with a single sentence. Silence teaches what punishment can't. She closed the file, secured it in the case, and switched off the lamp. The bruise pulsed once as she lay back. The cot creaked. Outside, the wind scattered sand along the walkway in small, scraping whispers. And somewhere in the dark, a place built on noise finally began to learn from quiet. By dawn, the first ripple of consequence reached beyond the wire. A visiting logistics officer arrived for an unscheduled drop and noticed the altered tone before his boots hit the dirt. No shouting matches, no instructors posturing. He asked one of the privates near the gate what happened. The private didn't look up as he answered. Someone made them remember why the rules exist. The officer asked who. The kid hesitated, then said she didn't give her rank, she didn't need to. Inside the admin trailer, Lowe filled out the report to accompany the footage. He wrote it carefully without dramatics, just facts, dates, actions, outcomes. Before signing, he added something he hadn't planned to write. Impact sustained does not equal impact returned. He read it once, then left it. Truth didn't need flair. Outside, the flag climbed the pole with its usual rattle. The metal clip struck the shaft twice, then settled. Recruits lined up with less shuffling than usual, eyes forward, shoulders squared, breathing steady. Hayes called roll. Vega watched posture without comment. Ellison checked gear quietly. And Riina stood near the edge of the mat, clipboard at her side, tracking everything and nothing at once. There was no announcement of her presence, no salute, no title spoken, but every inhale around her landed with more intention than the day before. Even the dust seemed to pause before rising. A change had started, uninvited, unstoppable, spoken in the language of restraint. And those who once mistook silence for surrender were learning, one breath at a time, that it wasn't surrender at all. It was warning. How do you measure the shift in a place built on noise? By the quiet that follows, or by the men who stop pretending they don't hear it? By mid-morning, the desert heat pressed against the compound like a palm sealing over a mouth. The sun climbed slow, burning the edges of every surface until steel looked white-hot and shadows retreated to the narrowest cracks. Riina crossed the yard with a stack of updated compliance forms under one arm, the wrap beneath her uniform tight enough to support, loose enough to breathe. She didn't limp, she didn't slow. Pain was part of the architecture now, but it didn't get to choose where she walked. At the ops trailer, a two-star liaison officer from Interbranch Command sat in a folding chair across from Captain Lowe. His uniform was immaculate in the way only people who spend their time in offices manage. He'd arrived an hour earlier to review circumstances, which was code for assessing how much paperwork had to be filed to keep command optics clean. Riina stepped inside without knocking. The liaison officer glanced up briefly, then did a double take when he registered the insignia on her collar. "Commander Carter," he said, tone neutral, "I've been briefed on the situation." She set the files on the table. "These are the documented violations, cross-referenced by timestamp. Infractions by instructors are outlined in the first section." He opened the top file, expecting bullet points. Instead, he found detailed entries with no embellishment: incorrect form instruction, unsafe sparring oversight, failure to implement breath control protocols, unreported physical contact. Each violation supported by a time code and corresponding clip reference. "Where is the incident report regarding the altercation you experienced?" he asked without looking up. "There isn't one." He glanced at her. "You're declining to file." "I'm enforcing training standards, not pursuing grievance." Lowe watched the exchange without stepping in. The liaison officer leaned back in his chair, studying her for something he couldn't name. "You understand," he said carefully, "that command has grounds to pursue disciplinary action against the individuals involved." "They've been suspended from instructional duty," she said. "That's already corrective." "And the assault?" She corrected him without blinking. "The breach of conduct has already been addressed through enforced protocol." He measured her tone. "What message does that send?" She answered without hesitation. "That silence isn't the absence of consequence." Lowe almost smiled at that, but didn't. The liaison officer closed the file. "We'll review the footage and the logs you've compiled. Command may request your presence for further inquiry. I'll be available until evaluation is complete. And after that, I move to the next site." He frowned slightly. "You don't want placement here." "This place needs enforcement," she said, "not permanence." Lowe understood. The liaison officer didn't, but he pretended he did. When she left the trailer, she didn't see Santos standing half-hidden between the motor pool awning and the stacked crates. But he saw her. And something in the way she carried herself now, something in the lack of acknowledgement, cut deeper than being thrown to the mat had. Miller and Greer stood a few yards away, pretending to review equipment manifests they hadn't been trained to handle. Neither spoke. Their silence wasn't principled. It was survival. Near the barracks, Rosas and Chen scrubbed down rifles under a shade tarp. Rosas glanced up as Riina passed. "You think she's leaving after this?" he whispered. Chen tightened a bolt with steady hands. "No, she'll leave when we don't need her to stay." Across the field, Ferris and Nolan ran drills they weren't assigned, breath work integrated into every motion. Neither had asked permission. Neither had been told to stop. By noon, the liaison officer moved from mild skepticism to quiet deference. He sat with Captain Lowe reviewing footage from the drill. Riina appeared on screen again and again, subtle pivots, efficient contact, silence where others would have filled space with ego. When the bruised skin flashed into frame, the officer paused. "She kept training after this." Lowe didn't look away. "She ran the entire evaluation before anyone noticed. No one reported the injury. They didn't notice it until the footage." The officer's mouth tightened. "She didn't flinch." "No," Lowe said. "She just adjusted." Outside, Hayes organized the afternoon rotation with quiet command. His voice carried in short, clipped sentences. No echoes, no bravado. Instructors who'd once barked to fill space now issued direction with words chosen for use, not volume. Vega passed out sparring gloves to the recruits. Breathing before motion, she told them. Control before contact. The language wasn't new, the enforcement was. A few yards away, Ellison reset the training cones exactly where Riina had placed them the day before, not because he'd been told to, but because they finally understood why they'd been placed there in the first place. Riina stepped onto the field only once that afternoon to observe. She didn't interfere. She didn't shadow. She didn't correct unless correction meant preventing injury. The shifts were small but undeniable. Recruits no longer glanced at instructors for permission to adjust form. They glanced to make sure they were doing it right. Hayes watched her cross the lot and wiped sweat from his forehead. "You going to run another evaluation tomorrow?" he asked. "No, they've already been evaluated. They're testing themselves now." "You think it'll stick?" She looked past him to where Chen and Rosas were drilling takedowns with slower breath and sharper attention. "It already has." He nodded once, not agreement, acknowledgement. The liaison officer left the compound late afternoon with a drive containing footage, written logs, and suspension notices, all tied to timestamps that couldn't be argued. He didn't thank her. She didn't wait for it. When he boarded the transport back to the regional command outpost, his radio crackled with requests from other camps, not asking for her specifically, but asking if someone could review protocol enforcement. Word traveled faster than rank. Twilight arrived on a breeze that tasted like copper and sand. The day cooled just enough for people to unclench their jaws. Ferris and Nolan sat outside the barracks cleaning their canteens. Nolan wiped hers with the edge of her sleeve. "You ever seen anyone take a hit like that and stay standing the next day?" Ferris shook her head. "I've seen people take hits like that and scream." "How'd she get back up?" "She never went down." Not far away, two senior sergeants leaned against the side of a Humvee, watching the recruits wrap up evening drills. "You think they'll send her to Pendleton next?" one asked. The other smirked. "If they're smart, they'll send her everywhere." In the instructor quarters, Miller sat against the wall with his head tipped back and eyes shut. He wasn't asleep. Greer sat across from him tying and retying the same knot in a length of paracord. Miller finally spoke without opening his eyes. "You ever think about what would have happened if she'd hit back?" Greer didn't look up. "You'd be in the infirmary." "That's not what I mean." "I know." Silence stretched between them like a line neither of them wanted to cross out loud. Santos stayed in his bunk longer than usual. He didn't pace. He didn't slam anything. His anger had no target now because the person he wanted to blame hadn't played his game. That left him with the only opponent a man like him isn't trained to fight, his own reflection. As evening shadows stretched across the training yard, Riina returned to the mat again. This time she didn't step onto it. She stood at the edge, arms loose at her sides, watching the last of the light burn itself across the horizon. A breeze caught the corner of the rolled tarp and lifted it a few inches before letting it fall. Hayes approached, stopping beside her but not too close. "You're not staying much longer," he said. "No." "You'll file your summary tonight." "Yes." He waited, then asked the only question that mattered. "Why not bury them with what you know?" She kept her eyes on the horizon. "Because fear fades, memory doesn't." He nodded once. "They won't forget." "They don't need to remember me. They need to remember themselves." Hayes looked at the mat. "You think silence really teaches that?" "No," she said. "Consequences do. Silence just carries them farther." Night thinned the light to silver. The stars surfaced one at a time, slow and patient. The compound settled under it like a held breath. She left the yard without looking back. In her quarters, she opened the case file one last time. She didn't add anything new. She didn't revise a word. She signed the bottom of the summary and closed the folder. Outside, the wind scraped dust along the walkway in long strokes. The bruise on her abdomen pulsed once before going quiet again. Power didn't shout in places like this. It didn't threaten. It didn't announce itself. It stepped into a corridor quietly, took a hit, stood back up. And everyone who saw it happen learned, some for the first time, that strength doesn't always make a sound. Sometimes it just waits. And waiting in the right hands is lethal. What does a place remember? The noise that once filled it, or the silence that changed it? Morning came without ceremony. There was no announcement, no polished briefing, no raised voices clinging to hierarchy, just the scrape of boots on gravel and the slow, quiet swell of movement across Camp Eagle Run. Things were happening the way they were supposed to, not because someone barked orders, but because someone had shown what happened when no one did. Riina stepped into the early light with her case file sealed and strapped under her arm. The wrap beneath her uniform hugged the bruise like a boundary, not a wound. Pain was now something she controlled, not something that dictated her day. The training yard was already alive. Recruits moved in organized sections, but not out of fear. Their breathing carried differently, slower, deeper, deliberate. No one wasted breath trying to appear strong. They spent it learning how not to break. Hayes and Vega oversaw hand-to-hand warm-ups, but neither raised their voice. They didn't need to. Cadence existed now in the rhythm of controlled motion. Ferris paired off with Nalin under the shade cloth, both women moving through slow grapples that emphasized breath over brawl. Rosas and Chen watched, then mirrored the same packing with subconscious mimicry. The mats weren't just practice grounds anymore. They were memory boards. At the far end, Ellison briefed a smaller group on contact drills. He referenced breath control without looking at a manual. The recruits didn't roll their eyes. They listened. Not far off, Santos stood beside the outer fence, arms crossed, watching with a jaw that no longer tried to lead. Greer sat on a low crate nearby, idly picking at the edge of his sleeve. Miller leaned against a post, sunglasses hiding the part of him he didn't yet understand how to face. None of them entered the yard. They weren't barred by rope or regulation. They were barred by something they didn't expect to feel, exclusion without expulsion. Captain Lowe approached Riina near the operations trailer with a tablet in one hand. "Command reviewed your files," he said. "Suspensions stand. They're sending oversight officers next week to observe corrective training." "Good," she said. He hesitated. "They asked if you'd stay on until the rotation completes." "No." "You're certain?" "This isn't mine to keep," she said. "It's theirs to maintain." Lowe nodded, not arguing. "They'll send a replacement for the liaison role." "They'll send someone to read notes," she corrected. "Whether they enforce them is up to them." Lowe watched her face, not looking for softness, looking for the reason she still hadn't flinched. "You'll be leaving today." "Yes." "Before briefing." "I've already briefed them." He followed her gaze out toward the yard where Hayes corrected a stance with a simple touch at the elbow, not a barked order. "They'll keep it going," Lowe said. "They'd better," she replied, "or this place will swallow them again." He didn't argue. He'd seen what happened when things were swallowed here, and he'd seen what happened when something refused to be. By midday, word had spread quietly the way important news travels. Some recruits passed it along as a fact. Others absorbed it like weather, inevitable, unchangeable. No one staged farewells. No one formed a line to shake hands. They didn't need to. Riina crossed the yard one last time, the sun flattening shadows underfoot. She didn't walk around the mats, she walked across them, each step a reminder, not a statement. A few recruits paused their drills, not to watch, to take measure. You don't hold a moment like that with applause. You hold it by breathing through it. As she passed, Rosa spoke low to Chen. "She's leaving." Chen didn't stop moving. "She already left yesterday. Today is just distance." At the edge of the yard, Nalin and Ferris stood side by side, both sweating, both calm. Nalin asked, "You think she'll come back?" Ferris shook her head. "She doesn't need to." Near the motor pool, Hayes met her with a clipboard tucked under his arm. He didn't salute. She didn't offer rank. He said, "We'll keep the mats rolled out. Don't roll them away when no one's looking." "We won't. And when someone forgets why breath matters, we'll remind them." She didn't nod. She didn't thank him. She just let silence settle between them, the same silence she used to reset an entire compound. Santos was the only one who stepped forward as she neared the gate. He didn't block her path. He didn't square his shoulders or brace his stance or pretend to own anything. He just stood there, hands at his sides, eyes not quite meeting hers. "You could have ended my career," he said. She didn't slow. "I didn't need to." His throat worked around words he couldn't place. You didn't hit back." She paused just long enough for him to feel the space she allowed before answering. "You think that spared you?" He swallowed, unsure whether to apologize or disappear. She didn't wait for either. She stepped past him and kept walking. Miller and Greer moved aside without a word. Not respect, not fear, something closer to recognition of someone who had already rewritten the rules they thought they controlled. At the transport lane, an idling Humvee waited with her rucksack already tied down in the back. She climbed in without looking back at the compound. The engine rumbled. Dust lifted. Captain Lowe watched from the trailer steps, arms folded. Hayes stood near the yard's edge, eyes steady. Vega leaned against a rail post, one hand resting absently against her hip. None of them called out. They understood that some departures aren't exits, they're closures. The Humvee rolled down the dirt track leading away from the training grounds. The fence line shrank behind her, and the flags over the barracks fluttered once in the wind before falling still. Inside the compound, drills resumed. Not louder, not softer, just clearer. Chen exhaled before a takedown attempt instead of lunging blind. Rosas reset his stance without waiting for correction. Nalin counted her breath in silence between strikes. Ferris closed the gap on a hold without rushing. Hayes pointed to the mat and told a recruit, "Reset form, breathe, then move." And the trainee did without protest. By late afternoon, the sun leaned west and threw long gold across the lot. The air clung to the ground in shimmering waves. Vega pulled open the supply shed and saw the old mat straps left on a shelf. She smiled faintly. "Leave them out," she murmured. As shadows stretched, movement slowed to clean up and debrief. Instructors dismissed the last formation with words clipped short and even. Dust gathered in slow spirals, catching only the wind, not rising against boots. The bruise on Riena's abdomen continued healing somewhere miles down the road, but its echo still lived in the yard, in the pause before contact, in the breath before motion, in the silence before consequence. Night crawled back over Camp Eagle Run, one muted star at a time. The mess tent lights flickered on again, but the noise that used to fill them didn't return. It had been replaced with something else, something no one needed to say out loud to feel. Not fear. Not worship. Alignment. Because once a place learns the cost of ignoring quiet strength, it doesn't forget quickly. And once people witness someone rise from the floor without rage, they start to wonder why they ever believed anger made them strong. Even the flags above the barracks seemed to move differently when the wind caught them after dark, less like declarations, more like acknowledgments. Somewhere far ahead of the compound, in whatever outpost she would walk into next, Riena Carter would carry the same silence with her. Not to threaten, not to haunt. To remind. Not with noise. With consequence. And those who met her, whether they knew her name or not, would feel it before she spoke a word. What lingers after someone leaves, the sound of their departure, or the space that refuses to close behind them. The night after she was gone, sleep didn't come the same way it used to. Not to the instructors, not to the recruits. Camp Eagle Run had learned something it couldn't unlearn, and even the dark carried it like a pulse just beneath the sand. Santos lay awake on his bunk longer than he'd ever admit. He replayed the moment she stood after his kick so many times the memory no longer felt like something external. It had moved inside him like a splinter that refused to work its way out. There been no fury in her eyes, no flinch, no need to posture. She had looked at him the way someone looks at a door that has already closed. The silence she left behind weighed heavier than any reprimand. Across the hall, Miller sat hunched on a crate, tying his boots even though it was past lights out. Greer leaned back against the wall, turning a small folding knife over in one hand without opening the blade. "You think she'll file something later?" Greer asked. Miller didn't look up. "If she wanted to bury us, she already would have." "You think that makes it better?" "No," Miller said. "I think it makes it permanent." Greer stopped flipping the knife. In the female barracks, Ferris lay still with her hands behind her head, staring past the ceiling into whatever tomorrow might require of her. Nolan rested on her side, one knee drawn up, eyes open in the dark. "Do you think she cared?" Nolan whispered. Ferris didn't answer at first. Then, "She cared that we do better, not that we like her for it." "That's enough. It changes more than orders ever did." Nolan let out a quiet breath. "I'll take that over a speech." Outside, the night wind pushed dry air across the yard, lifting traces of dust from the mats and the cracks in the concrete. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt occupied, like something present, watching, measuring. Just before dawn, Hayes unlocked the training shed and flipped on the low-slung work light. His boots scuffed across the mat as he unrolled it alone. Vega arrived a few minutes later, hair tied back, gloves in hand. Neither spoke beyond the nod they shared. Ellison appeared next, then two recruits who hadn't been asked to come but showed up anyway. They started drills before the sun breached the horizon. No announcements, no whistles, just breath and motion, the way she'd shown them without a word. Chen practiced controlled strikes with Rosas, not to dominate but to calibrate. Ferris stretched out a shoulder and corrected Nolan's stance with the same precision she'd once resented in others. Miller and Greer lingered near the fence line, hands in their pockets, watching without comment. Captain Lowe passed by on his way to the admin office. He didn't interrupt. He didn't supervise. He simply observed long enough to know the ground had shifted, quietly, definitively. Later that morning, an email hit his desk from Regional Command. "Commander Carter's assessment is accepted. Her recommendations will be implemented across the next 3 sites. Forward personnel files and training logs." It didn't mention the incident. It didn't need to. It followed the gravity of what she'd already done. By noon, the compound was running like an organism that had finally become aware of its own bones. Instructors no longer barked to feel tall. Recruits no longer tensed at every correction. There was a new understanding settling in their movements. Strength was no longer a weapon first. It was a discipline. Even the mess hall felt different. Fewer jokes thrown like punches. More space between noise and reaction. Nobody spoke her name, but the absence of the old tension told the story well enough. On the far perimeter road, dust still hovered where her transport had passed the day before. Tracks from the Humvee wheels had already begun to fade under the wind, but the direction they pointed in remained clear, forward, not back. Hayes and Vega held a short debrief with the other instructors under the awning near the motor pool. The clipboard Hayes carried looked worn, but the tone he used was new, plain, steady, absent of the grit people add when they're afraid of sounding unsure. "Breath control remains permanent," he said. "No exceptions." Vega added, "No more loud corrections. Precision only. If you do know why you're teaching something, don't teach it." Ellison adjusted his cap. "We handling sparring oversight the same way she did." "Yes," Hayes said. "Hands-on only for correction, never for dominance." They didn't cast glances at Santos, Miller, or Greer. They didn't have to. The line had been drawn silently, and everyone now knew which side of it they stood on. By late afternoon, the compound returned to its rhythm, but not the old one. Voices stayed lower. Movements held purpose. And every now and then, someone unconsciously looked toward the gate, not expecting her return but acknowledging the direction she'd come from. In the operations office, Lowe drafted a message to leadership at the next installation she was scheduled to assess. He hesitated only once before typing the final sentence. Do not underestimate her silence. It is not absence, it is doctrine. He hit send. The sun dropped low, throwing the compound into long shadows. Dust rose and settled in thin bands along the track to the motor pool. A few recruits stayed out to practice longer than assigned, working breath into every shift of weight. As the last light died, Vega tied down the mats and paused with one hand resting on the edge. We're not going back to what it was, she said quietly. Hayes didn't disagree. We couldn't if we wanted to. And Santos? Hayes didn't look over his shoulder. He'll carry what she didn't say longer than what she could have done. Vega exhaled. That's the part they'll never understand. Hayes almost smiled as he turned to leave. They don't need to understand it. They just need to feel it. Night pulled itself across the base like a blanket shaken once and let go. The wind softened. The flags on the poles finally stilled. Far beyond the wire, the convoy that had carried her on was already leagues ahead, cutting a path through another stretch of desert where another unit thought it knew the measure of consequence. They wouldn't see her arrival coming. They'd just feel the change after she left. And somewhere down that line, in whatever barracks, yard, or command office she walked into next, someone would try to test her the way men always test what they don't recognize. And someone would learn the same lesson Camp Eagle Run did. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.